Hey everybody, welcome back to another This Week in Coworking recap episode. This week we're going to dive into some pretty rich data coming out of both the US and the UK and Irish markets. We're going to look at a bunch of other things. Mike, what else is on the roster this week?
It's a jam-packed week. Like you mentioned, Coworking Cafe dropped a ton of data for both North America and EMEA. We've got a couple newsworthy nonprofit angles about folks that can get access to discounted or free co-working space, a ton of expansions and new openings. I think we're also going to dive into a little WeWork news because what would a week in co-working be without WeWork news? And then last but not least, I think we got something a really good piece on Wi-Fi security and kind of network infrastructure.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Welcome to This Week in Coworking, where industry leaders get succinct, actionable insights. Here are your hosts, Hector Colones and Mike LaRosa.
So getting started, we start off the top of the week with which topic, Mike? What do you want to dive into first?
Well, I think the data, I think people always love data. They always want to see where they're stacking up with the rest of the industry. And I got to hand it to them. They are at an advantage because they do have a significant amount of that data. But it is really wonderful that Coworking Cafe shares this and has leaned into a quarterly kind of transparent, market assessment. So if we want to dive right into the US North American market, it was actually really exciting to see that Washington, D.C., about 15 miles from where I am now, bumped Manhattan from the third spot of number of spaces in the market, which is surprising, but not really surprising. We've talked about a bit in the past that DC has this inflated commercial real estate market because of the height restriction for buildings that are in DC proper.
Mhm.
And it should be interesting to see without dipping our toes in any political discussions, but just understanding what changes are coming to the greater DC metro area as a lot more people are called back into various federal buildings, some that do have space, some that don't have space. And it's always been a very interesting market. A lot of contractors in this area rely on flex to start with because they are on these shorter term contracts. They can't necessarily be on site for where their clients are in government buildings. So that was really interesting. I think Manhattan's not going anywhere as it relates to number of spaces or what they can charge, but it is exciting to see that other markets are starting to catch up. I think the last time we talked about this last quarter, Dallas was like the big market that kind of boosted up, which makes a
Mhm.
lot of sense. Companies are relocating to Texas for various reasons. And I think we're seeing an overall growth in number of spaces, particularly in the suburbs. And Dallas, the DFW Metroplex, as they call it, is just one huge, massive suburb, right? Just big cities anchoring it. But if you go to any of the different parts of the city, you might feel like you're actually in a suburb. Any other numbers jump out at you, Hector? I think the same cities that were high up there on the list were already moving on up last quarter,
Yeah.
right?
So we definitely saw continued growth. I think they saw a continued growth across the data that they shared, around 2% growth in kind of the number of spaces, getting close to that thousand points. I think we're just about surpassing that at 7,000 locations across the US, which is always good to see that growth. But what I found really interesting was that normally when you see a growth in supply, pricing comes down, right? More competition, more availability, more open offices. We're not seeing that, right? We're seeing that fixed desks and virtual offices pretty much stayed the same, medium across nationwide. Worth noting that this data is from the 25 largest cities in the US, so it's not identity, it's not digging into every small suburb or every small city, but it's a good benchmark for what's happening across the US. But I think hot desks came down by $1. So nothing really to report about, but good to see the fact that there's more supply coming onto the market, more spaces opening, but pricing staying standard. That's what you want to see. You want to see more take up. You want to see spaces getting filled without that dip in pricing that we saw in previous surges of supply.
Yeah, I was really impressed to see that the dedicated desk rate had stayed consistent as well. I feel like dedicated desks, I think also maybe because of a indirect result of COVID, dedicated desks, I feel like, have been in this limbo land for the last couple years because people they want to share, but they don't necessarily want to share open space,
Hmm.
right? They want to have their own desk. A lot of spaces when I typically visit them, the dedicated desk inventory is typically the last available. A lot of operators use it as a great way to get people in the door if they're on a waiting list for a private office.
Hmm.
So maybe that's also what's keeping that rate up.
Yeah.
As it relates to just number of spaces, it was really exciting to see that year over year for Q4, there was a 23% growth in spaces and a 13% growth in total square footage. So
Hmm.
I think we're really starting to hit that finally that hockey stick. We've been talking about the hockey stick for a decade, and I think we're finally we're on our way up. If we hop over across the pond, anything that jumped out at you in particular, since you're my resident London expert, since you lived there,
I
anything kind
mean,
of take you by surprise?
yeah, the fact that UK and Ireland are seeing like 3,300 or 3,300, as we say back in the UK, locations across the two countries is a huge number. I remember back in 2013, there was maybe six co-working spaces. You could throw a stone and no one would catch it. There's no one out there who knew what co-working was. There was obviously Regis had a very stronghold there, promoted this idea of co-working, but now seeing these kind of homegrown brands expanding. If you look at the top five there, almost all of them, except for the IWG ones, even the IWG ones, I guess, are homegrown, right? Really strong markets, good numbers as well. We saw a steadying out of the pricing across the UK. Manchester is just growing really fast. I remember going back and launching. Oh, there was one co-working space when we got there, spun out of the Tech Hub franchise, and I helped launch another three, and that was co-working, right? That was all the co-working spaces in Manchester, and now you've got members clubs, you've got co-working spaces, you've got flex. It's just a fantastic evolution that's happened, and it's always good to see these numbers coming out. Obviously, going back to what you said, co-working cafe is very, very generous with kind of sharing this benchmark data, and
Yeah.
recent acquisitions have made co-working cafes data even richer. So I hope that we're going to keep seeing this kind of reporting. It's good for all of us. We're going to kind of try and get some of the co-working cafe folks in for the next quarter. Maybe we'll get them to run through the data with us, and dig a little bit deeper as well.
Yeah, the one thing that I will leave us on was I was really surprised that maybe I am mistaken, but for the first time in a while, the prices for dedicated desks were actually more expensive in the US, right? And so we always hear London's the most expensive city in the world, or one of them, right? You got New York, London, Singapore. But it was really interesting accounting for conversion
Mhm.
and exchange rates. If a dedicated desk average in the UK is coming in at 210 pounds, that's 261 US dollars. So that's coming in under the $300 a month that are being charged in the US. Ireland was not as much of a discrepancy. The euro dollars trading much more closely. So for 277 euros, that's probably what, $285. But it was interesting to see that the overall median price for the US was higher. I don't know if you remember, but I always thought that US was coming in below just because there's so much more inventory that aren't in like tier one cities, right? Like I always say, a desk in Tulsa, Oklahoma is a lot cheaper than a desk in Manhattan is.
Yeah, I think actually you bring up a good point, and that is that spread out of the regional operators in the UK, right? We're seeing those numbers. They're kind of being balanced out at median because London isn't at that be all end all of all the pricing across the UK,
Yeah.
right? If we look at the 70 plus locations in Manchester, a few more in like Bristol, Brighton, Birmingham, these are all kind of bringing the median down because
Yeah.
we're not only talking about London rates anymore. I remember there was times when I moved to London from Manchester and it was six, seven, $800, $900 a dedicated desk, £900 a dedicated desk overlooking the river, etc., things like that.
Yeah.
And then in the outskirts, zones three, zone four, 250, £200 a month for a dedicated desk. I think that with more locations out in the other cities outside of London, that's probably why we're seeing it steady out and become more attractive as a pricing point, given the fact that it's not just zone one in the city in London.
Yep. And that's why we loved having Hector take the lead on This Week in Coworking, because that's an obvious conclusion, right? Because we just said that there were more spaces opening up in Manchester. So there you go, full circle on that. Maybe I just need another cup of coffee. But I think that tackles all the data. There's a ton more that we just can't get into because it would be an hour and a half long podcast. But check out the newsletter, click out the link, go visit the Co-working Cafe blog. They really are doing some cool work. But yeah, I would love to hear what people think. And if they want to have us invite folks from Yardi to come join us, I'm sure that there's plenty of additional insight that they could to offer us. Next up is something that you wanted to chat about a little bit, nonprofits and co-working. So there, it's in our impact section. Hector, take it away.
Absolutely. So there was two different pieces this week in the impact section. If you don't get the newsletter yet, head over to twic.co and just sign up for the free newsletter, or click on week 6 and you'll know what the hell we're talking about. But in that section under impact, we look at how co-working touches and affects the communities that it lives within. This week, we looked at how in Gowanus region or neighborhood in Brooklyn, a co-working space originally out of Salt Lake City called The Shop has actually agreed to these kind of community guidelines to create affordable artist studios. And we're talking about a third, maybe even less than the average asking price for an artist studio in the area. They're going to start offering this and a guarantee of no more than 2% increase per year in the rent. So for artists in the area, when they started rezoning, they were a bit upset that they're going to get pushed out of this thriving artist region. And so this deal that they've struck, and now The Shop is operating the spaces for them, is a really interesting approach. What made me think about it from the other side is there are already shared spaces in the region. There are neighborhood co-working spaces that are already there who cannot or will not be able to offer studios at this price. So what will happen there? Yes, I get that they need to create the space for the folks that may have been displaced by the gentrification or regeneration of the area. But what does that mean for the existing businesses? Are they getting some sort of support to also bring down their price and make it affordable? That's the one piece. And it's a really interesting kind of concept. I love the fact that The Shop is doing this, and it's great for the local artist scene and the folks who need that studio space to keep creating, keep inspiring. We just have to think about how it plays in a kind of macroeconomic local market. Any thoughts on that before I jump onto the next one, Mike?
Not in particular on these two stories, but it does remind me that there is actually like an association of community spaces. And I've always been surprised that there hasn't been more overlap between the co-working world and this like nonprofit community shared space. I'll have to, I should have been better prepared. I don't remember what the name is, but I actually encountered one in the DC area because what it was literally co-working for nonprofits, and it funded by a grant. So it was a combination of state and local dollars and the developer taking advantage of some type of incentive, I'm sure. And it involved application process. So it just, I've always been curious. It's a very large, long-standing association. They all meet every year for a big conference. So it's just interesting to see that there hasn't been a collision yet in
Yeah.
the professional industry circuit world, but obviously artists and nonprofits have always played such a large part of the more community-minded co-working spaces. Some good points
Yes.
into like how others can compete against some of this subsidized space.
Yeah, you also bring up a good point, and that's that these spaces, about 100 plus studios are going to be released under this kind of really affordable package. They're actually being done in a lottery system. So there is an artist community or collective that's running this lottery program to decide who gets these spaces, much like you apply for grants. And so that it is a kind of collaboration between a very commercial co-working company owned by the domain companies and this group that represents local artists. On that topic, this week's sponsor is the Co-working Alliance Summit. That's going to be happening in March. I know that one of the big topics that we're going to be digging into there is also how do you create these partnerships between co-working spaces and local communities, collectives, associations, nonprofits, etc. So definitely check that out. It's in the newsletter as well. Sign up. If you are part of a co-working alliance, attending is completely free. And if you're not, create a co-working alliance and then join us, or just grab a ticket and we'll see you at the summit. But the other story I wanted to quickly talk about end of the impact section is an interesting play. We've seen a lot of different programs throughout the years. I know WorkHub has done this. I know that a few others, WorkBar has done the same, where they create programs, and CoHatch has done the same as well, where
Yep.
they do programs to support nonprofits, whether it's a scholarship or subsidized rent or something like that. We saw a new offering this week from Switchyards, where they trialed in one of their cities a completely free membership for nonprofits, and they're now rolling that out to about 5 or 6 other cities. Fantastic for nonprofits, great to get them into this kind of work club co-working environment. But I also know that many co-working spaces in places like Atlanta are homes to a lot of nonprofits. So it's always good to see, okay, there's more support coming, but is it cannibalizing net co-working revenue from other spaces within the same ecosystem? So that's just something I'm thinking about. The more people co-working, the better, but I'm just trying to figure out whether it does cannibalize and create pricing tension between operators. I think you can remember back to certain brands launching in new countries and giving a year free rent, or some sort of policy to get people out of there where they are, and created a bit of chaos in the local economy, the co-working economy. So yeah, just worth thinking about that as well as we see these kind of campaigns. Hopefully it doesn't create like a race to the bottom where everyone's giving away co-working membership to hopefully get in some other revenue.
Yeah, I don't. So, having worked with nonprofits and having sold co-working space to nonprofits, and also knowing that Switch Yards is most definitely more of the work club format, I think that there's actually great overall rising tide lifts all
Mhm.
ships mentality here, because a lot of nonprofits start as a sole proprietor, right? Like it's a founder or it's someone that's really moved by a specific mission. They have literally no money, but they need to go somewhere. And so
Mhm.
I think that if you are a larger nonprofit and you have an office space, I don't think Switch Yards is going to bring you a free office, right? And so I think overall, I'm bullish on the strategy because I think it just gets more people into the ecosystem, right? And it's also probably a great way to network and try to grow support for that nonprofit because now you're surrounded by a lot of other people and you're able to connect with folks and get your mission out there. So I don't, I think that the point that you make, it is legitimate, but I don't think in this case there's a major issue. If it was more some governments that are subsidizing for startups or smaller businesses,
Mhm.
then I think you've got probably a bigger problem there. But yeah, I think all in all, it's probably pretty good.
Well said. I love that viewpoint.
Yeah, we've got a ton of expansions. I don't want to just run through them, but there are a lot, so we don't want to take up too much time. So it was really exciting to hear Space Made is adding another industry specific location, this time in Notting Hill. If you're not familiar with Space Made, Hector has a great podcast interview with Johnny Rosenblatt, and he's dives in that conversation about the strategy Space Made is executing as it relates to operator agreements with
Mhm.
like partnerships with the landlords, but also industry specific type spaces. So this is cool to see that it's going to be another industry specific space. We've got in San Clemente, Tailored Space is opening up their 10th location. This one will be in Southern California, and they've got 5 more on the way. We had an announcement from Infinite Space with new additions in both Amsterdam and Berlin. An OG co-working brand a lot of people know in the Mid-Atlantic, the Candy Factory in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They're adding a second location, which is pretty exciting. I still don't have the whole backstory on why they call it the Candy Factory. I probably should know that story. I'll have to figure that out someday because I've always been curious about that.
Got a
Um,
better idea. Let's just bring them on and ask them.
yeah, so we'd love to
Let's do
hear
that.
from you guys. We've got a Dutch operator, HNK. They're opening up a seventh location in Rotterdam. That's 10 total within the Netherlands. Cloudworks announced in, this is a Spanish operator, that they are dropping €1 million into opening up a new 1,000 square meter space, which is pretty large. And then last but not least, we've got a new Venture X opening up in Miami. Florida is a where VentureX is headquartered, so it's no surprise there to see that franchisees are adding additional spaces. So this isn't just a new franchisee, this is a franchisee that already has one and is opening up a second. And so that's pretty exciting. A lot of expansions and openings, Hector. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts? I guess it matches the data, right? We
yeah,
saw from
it
Coworking Cafe.
it does go back to that data. It also shows that it's got equilibrium, right? What I was mentioning a bit earlier, we're seeing more supply come onto the market, but we're not seeing price dip, which is showing a really healthy state of the economy, co-working economy again. Um, Here in the U.S. in kind of suburbs and and outside of the big cities, you saw that shift in where the most co-working spaces are. That's constantly shifting. So I think it's really good to see that from a US level, but it's always fantastic to see growth in the Netherlands, growth across kind of the rest of the world, as we used to call it when I wasn't here in the US, the rest of us. So it's just good to see this growth. We did see some contractions. We saw some buildings change hands as well this week, but they were all behind paywalls. And here at This Week in Co-working, we do not share email gated content because we want you to be able to get to the news and not have to trust just us. We will summarize it for you, but we want you to be able to see the source. And if we can't get that information, we just won't share it. But we did see a slight contractions. Spaces stayed open. They just changed the owners of the buildings. So we're going to hopefully dive into that when it's more publicly accessible information. But we also had a pretty big market move that wasn't an expansion, and that comes back to, wait for it, an IPO for WeWork. Now, not WeWork, the company that just went through the whole process and joined us on the podcast recently, but WeWork India. Fascinating story of how this joint venture became a solely owned company. Definitely check their brand profile out on the newsletter. If you click on WeWork India, it now takes you to their own separated brand profile from the WeWork profile, because it is a separate company. It has the same brand, it has the same ethos, which was created as a joint venture. But while WeWork Inc. was going through its kind of restructuring and bankruptcy procedure, it was the rest of the joint venture was bought out by the other shareholders. So Embassy Group took over the brand. They hit first-time profitability last year, reporting a $20 million half-year profit for 2024 up to the second quarter of 2024. So great numbers. They showed, I think, $190 million in revenue across their network in the region. And so they're going for a listing and an IPO over in the Mumbai Stock Exchange. I'm glad to report that I have not heard any references about community adjusted EBITDA. But the one thing worth noting is this is not raising money like you normally see to put money into the company to fuel growth. This is actually the equity owners, the Embassy Group, selling their equity on a public market, or some of their equity in a public market, to liquefy and get some liquidity of their investment.
Yep. For those of you that might not be familiar with doing business in India, anytime an outside company comes into the market, they have to form a joint venture with an Indian company that then retains majority, whether it be 51% or more. WeWork India has always been the shining star of the global WeWork portfolio as it relates to profitability. And I think that I'm most excited to see that this is actually like a solid, legit, old school IPO. This isn't the next startup that's still losing hundreds of millions of dollars but needs to raise money. To your point, this is traditional investors that are going through the traditional steps of converting their investment into liquidity and bringing it to the market. Who knows what will happen with the other entities? You know, Yardi obviously controls the majority of the WeWork main brand here. I'm actually not as knowledgeable on some of the other subsidiaries, right? Because they've got, I think, one that's in Asia, one that's in South America. I forget if Africa was or was not. They might have closed all of them down. But all in all, I think this was generally another positive kind of lift of news for the WeWork brand, and just continued proof that the model does work if it's run in a very sustainable, manageable growth mindset. And good on them, and wish them the best of luck with the IPO.
Absolutely. I think it does also remind us that this is another publicly listed co-working or co-working related company, which gives us just more tracking variables, right? It's
Yep.
always been good to go under the hood at IWG's numbers, at the Workplace Group in the UK, at Watso and their PropCo OpCo operations in Australia. So having just more public companies in our industry gives us a lot more validity and feeds that capital market confidence that we're starting to see as more and more lenders become increasingly flex curious and are starting to write loans and support and build business cases for the fact that your co-working space is probably more of a safe investment or loan structure than an empty building with no tenants. I think it's a very good sign, and it just gives us more, gives the capital markets more to chew on and more facts to process.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. And to your point, Hector, I've had a front row seat for the past couple months now, seeing how these banks and these REITs are having to embrace how to value buildings based on flex, or how to value buildings on something other than your traditional triple net lease. And to your point, this validates everything that we've been saying for many years and gives these entities, I think, additional coverage,
Mm-hmm.
right? To make the leap and take these, they're not, I wouldn't even consider it risks, but from the external and, traditional investor market, it's probably still considered a little risky. But I think now it's almost more risky not to do something um, in any capacity as it relates to updating your buildings for some type of flex or tech enabled access. All in all, really exciting news. And it's nice to have positive news in the industry, because for far too long it was just a punching bag, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
and it affected everyone, right?
Yep.
Not only during those boom days did they suck up all the oxygen and the money from investors, but it also, I think, made a lot of people skeptical and hesitant to invest.
Absolutely.
Last up that we've got to talk about this week is something that I'm actually enjoying to learning more about and dealing with kind of day to day with some of the work I'm doing at Proximity. But Isify had a really great written article. And like I've said before, at This Week in Co-working, when someone's got great content, we just love to shout it from the rooftops. So a lot of you out there that are listening probably got into co-working because you wanted to foster a community, you wanted to provide people with space to be productive. Maybe you yourself were just bored and lonely, or you were trying to figure out how to monetize excess space. I can guarantee you the vast majority of co-working operators out there did not get into this to get into Wi-Fi and internet security. It's something that I've been very conscious of for a long time. I've been hacked in a co-working space in Asia. I've been hacked while on an airplane using airplane Wi-Fi, where literally I was on a visa run and landed in Malaysia and then saw that my card had been charged for like $5,000 for air
Wow.
conditioners, right? And so I think that as more and more people get into co-working spaces and as more companies embrace them for their, corporate or enterprise employee groups, we really have to be mindful of not only being good kind of co-working members internally, right? But also good operators. So that way you're not, I think responsibility lies among many different parties
Yep.
when it comes to network infrastructure and network security. So you have to, the best offense is a good defense from an operator standpoint, but then also you can't just do the work of setting up the network and making sure you've got passwords, but you also have to then inform your community members. Something that we talk about all the time in my day job is we've all been to the co-working space where you walk in and there's a Wi-Fi password in the top right-hand corner of a whiteboard. That password probably hasn't been changed for 2 to 3 years. And not saying that someone's going to come into your community with ill intentions, but I've seen some really crazy stuff go down at co-working spaces, whether it be money laundering or this or that, or trying to use service offices for addresses, or I won't go down other stories. That's for maybe an after hours Twic podcast. But really it's fascinating to see all the different things that you need to know as it relates to not plugging certain devices into just random USB chargers. Someone might have been programming that for some malware on it, right? Having Wi-Fi networks that aren't just for single locations, but having Wi-Fi networks that are spun up for individual reservations.
Yep.
And so I know I'm rambling here, but it was a very long article, really well written and researched by Isify. I'm not surprised because that is their bread and butter. That's what they do. But you need more than just a Comcast or Spectrum router and a modem. You really need to understand because you're opening yourself up as an operator to various different liabilities if you don't cover it
Mhm.
for your members. And I think more and more companies are starting to not pursue legal action, but are more confident in staking out and making cases should things happen. And they will most definitely have the receipts. So that's enough rambling from me on internet security. Hector, have you ever encountered issues? Have you yourself been compromised or your devices?
I'm paranoid when it comes to security.
So you're
No.
already on top of it. You're not like me who just you
Yeah,
haven't been
so
taken advantage of because you were on top of it.
yeah, but it also comes down to what the space offers, right? If you go into a space and that is what they offer, that is the security infrastructure they have, there's only so many protections you can take, right? Um, the same as if you leave your phone unlocked on a counter and someone picks it up and they've seen your password, they can do anything they want on your phone. So it's about the environment as well and creating that safe environment. But I think you hit the nail on the head, whereas people who start co-working spaces don't start co-working spaces because they want to run IT networking businesses. They don't want to run software companies. They don't want to run integration companies. They don't want to run data copy and pasting all day companies, right? They want to do it because they want to make the impact that is important to them, and that's why they get into this business. So it is really important to look at this information and kind of think about, hey, that's something I didn't think about. Are there solutions out there that can help me fix this without me having to go and get a whole PhD in network security and encryption, right? And luckily, we're getting to that maturity point where there are not only solutions out there, but trusted sources or people you can speak to who are not there to make commissions on different platforms, but are there to help you build the right, what we call operating stack
Yeah.
to run a successful business, right? And obviously, that's me thinking about all the conversations I've had over the last couple of months over at my day job at Syncaroo. And that's where we love to shine, right? We're not here to tell you these are the 1,000 things that can go wrong and here's the 40,000 solutions that you can. What have you got today? Where do you want to be 6 months from now? And what pieces can you do to incrementally get better? And articles like this are the first step, right? Read about the security risks, read about the precautions you should be taking, but also start thinking about how does it plug together with the rest of your processes, right? It's one thing to have a fantastic system that spins up Wi-Fi and creates desk passes or day passes, creates secure disconnected silos of internet called VLANs. That's fantastic. But if it doesn't work with the rest of your sales process or the way that you're currently running your business or the management system that you're using or that Excel sheet that rules your life, nothing matters, right? Because it's not going to get done. And you're going to get back to that password written up on the whiteboard because there's just not enough time in the day. So read it, think about it, strategize, reach out to fantastic people, ask the questions, ping us questions if you want. I'm more than happy to. If it's a big enough topic, bring on experts and we can do another kind of a roundtable digging into the questions that you have around IC security, monetization, everything else.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that last word monetization because I think at first glance, it just might be, oh my gosh, this is more stuff that I have to spend money on. But actually, as with a lot of things in co-working and flex workspace and service offices, this could be an upsell. This could be a premium add-on. You might have some members that don't really care about having a private network or whatnot, but I guarantee you there will be enterprise users out there that will be happy to pay
Mhm.
for additional security and safety for their users and for all of their data.
Yeah, and
And you don't
dedicated
have to,
bandwidth as
yeah,
well, right? One thing that I was going through, just thinking of the things I've seen go wrong in co-working spaces, and it wasn't necessarily people getting hacked, but it was the middle of the Web3 craze. If you remember a couple of years ago, spaces were being rented out and people were just dropping machines that were doing mining.
Yep.
And that just sucks up bandwidth. So if you're just a normal member coming in and all of a sudden the internet is far slower because you're all sharing the same bandwidth, that's going to ruin the experience of the space. You're going to start exploring for other spaces. If the local coffee shop's Wi-Fi is better than the Wi-Fi that you're paying for at a co-working space,
Yeah.
that's a problem for the business case, right? So things like that, we don't see them coming. You don't know what people's intents are. They're just trying to make money on your electricity bill. But yeah, it's worth keeping in mind that there are precautions, but yeah, there is money to be made if you take the right approach.
For sure. That was a jam-packed week. There was a lot more in the newsletter, but how else would we get you all to go read it if we talked about it all in this podcast? And chances are, if you're listening, you're probably already a reader. So, once again, Hector, always great chatting with you. Any last parting thoughts or anything that you want listeners to know before we sign off for the week?
I think I only have one quick ask. If you enjoy this episode or any of our episodes, share them with someone else in the co-working world. That's all I would ask. This is definitely a passion project for all of us. We're funded by our Patreon brands. We're supported by some great brand sponsors. But we do this for you. We do this for the operators who there's just too much to consume, and we try to make it bite-sized. So if you know someone else who's feeling a bit overwhelmed, running a co-working space or thinking about co-working, please share the podcast with them, share the newsletter with them, help them have a greater next week.
Yep. And lastly, because we do see the stats, if you are listening, please take a moment just to hit that subscribe button because I can guarantee you that we have way more listeners than we do have subscribers. So if you found us or if you just said, okay, I'm going to listen to them, we're glad you're here, but it does a big help for us if you can just hit that little subscribe button. So that's the last thing. I'll leave with that.
Amazing. Thanks again, Mike. Look forward to next week.
See you, Hector.